Hello and welcome to Ford's Theater. We are so delighted to have you all here this evening. My name is Tricia Patrick. I'm the Director of Education, and it is my pleasure to work alongside my colleagues in advancing Ford's mission to explore the legacy of President Abraham Lincoln and celebrate the American experience through theater and education. Paul Tetraj, our director, had planned on being here personally to kickstart the event, but had to attend to responsibilities out of town. He sends his regards. Dr. Alan Guelzo is a longtime friend of Ford's Theater. In addition to being an award-winning author and Lincoln Scholar, he serves on Ford's Theater's Advisory Council, a group of nationally recognized historians and writers and performing artists who all share a love of President Lincoln and the values he exemplified. When Dr. Alan Guelzo reached out to us about hosting a talk around the new edition of Abraham Lincoln, Redeemer President, it just made sense that it would be here on this historic stage, a place that meant so much to Lincoln and where Americans come to remember him today. Abraham Lincoln, Redeemer President, is available for purchase in our gift shop this evening. And immediately following the conversation, Dr. Guelzo will be signing books in the lobby. If you enjoy discourse about Lincoln, and something tells me that you all do, we invite you to return on March 25th for the Abraham Lincoln Institute Symposium. To learn more and to reserve your free tickets, please visit our website at www.fords.org. While there are over 16,000 books and articles and essays written about President Abraham Lincoln, tonight we're here to discuss one book in particular. Please welcome to the stage Alan Z. Guelzo, Lucas Morel, and Richard Brookhiser.
We were deliberating before we came on as to who should speak first. And I said, well, I think I'll lead off, but mainly for the purpose of acknowledging so many friends who are in the audience tonight. Some friends that go back to high school days. Jay and his son Jamie are here, I believe. Roberta and her husband, I think, are here. Joyce and her husband, I think, are also here. And then there are so many other friends. I think Bill and Elaine are here. I know that Jeff and Cindy are here. Joshua and Solveig, I think, are here. And then, of course, my own family is here. My wife, Deborah, who really deserves all the credit for any credit there is to be given in these ways. And my son, Jonathan, and his wife, Candace, and their three children, three wonderful grandchildren. There's Cora, and then there's Isabel, and then there's, wait for it, Patrick Lincoln Russell Guelzo. So I'm so delighted that they are here. I'm so delighted you're all here. And now I'm thrown together with Rick Brookhiser and with Lucas Morel, and here we are on the stage of Ford's Theater, which, as you can imagine, always conjures up unusual emotions and reflections in my mind. I can never be on this stage or be in this building without always having in my mind the thought, the image of what happened that night. This is a wonderful place. I'm very grateful to Ford's Theater, to Paul Tetraj, to Tricia, and to all the staff here for so much work that has gone into this. C-SPAN is here tonight. So I'm very grateful for every preparation that has gone into the making of this evening, and to do it in this marvelous, this wonderful, and I even use the word, and this awful place, Ford's Theater. Well, I'll turn now to you two gentlemen. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Alan. I'll lead off. At Washington and Lee University, I teach courses in politics, and right now I'm teaching a seminar on Abraham Lincoln's statesmanship. Might be the only course on Abraham Lincoln's statesmanship taught in the United States. But what I tell them is whenever you read a book that has a title or a subtitle, put a question mark after it. And that will help you be a more engaged reader. So I'm going to do that with Alan's biography. Redeemer President? In other words, my question, I think it's something of a softball to start us off, get a little warmed up here, is why did you believe that Redeemer President was an apt title for your life of Lincoln? I'm pretty sure we're going to be talking about Lincoln and religion at least a few times tonight, but to associate Lincoln with redemption, can you tell us about that?
Well, I chose that as the subtitle. In fact, originally, I wanted that to be the front title of it. I wanted the book to be called Redeemer President Abraham Lincoln and the Ideas of Americans. But my editor at that point said that it would probably be a lot better if Abraham Lincoln were the first two words, because that's what the booksellers look for, the first two words of a title. So there was a perfectly pragmatic reason for running the title in the way it came out. But the phrase itself, Redeemer President, I used that because Walt Whitman told me to. Well, all right, he sort of did. When Whitman was not yet Walt Whitman the poet, he was the editor of a newspaper on Long Island. And in exasperation over the blandness and the mistakes of American politics in the 1850s, he wrote an editorial in which he asked out loud, when will we elect the Redeemer President of this republic? Now, he asks that in 1856. And I'm reading this in a biography of Whitman, and I'm thinking he had no idea that in 4 years he was going to get his answer. And so the phrase comes from Whitman that way. But there was also a certain irony in using that phrase that I was conscious of, because Redeemer President at once associates the notion of a presidency with redemption. And this is a religious concept. First of all, you're mixing politics and religion. All right, that's fine because it's a book about ideas. Ideas as much political as religious. But it also sets up a certain irony, because Abraham Lincoln is a man, shall we say, of fairly modest religious profile. He never joins a church. He never makes any kind of visible religious profession. He is never baptized. He never takes communion, never any of those things. He would attend churches from time to time, but never makes any affiliation or connection with them. And there was something ironic in the idea that this man with this very modest profile, religiously speaking, that this man should turn out to be an agent of redemption, as Walt Whitman described it, I thought was just simply delicious. And I thought, now there's the title right there. As soon as I had read that in Whitman, I thought, there's the title for the book. So it stands there, first of all, it roots things in the crises of the 1850s. But it also sets up this tension in Lincoln's life between a man who is raised in a very religious context. I mean, his parents, his family, very deeply committed to an ultra-predestinarian Baptist sect. But he grows up in adolescent rebellion against that. He faces in a very different direction. He becomes a devotee of Tom Paine. He becomes, in some respects, what some people called an infidel as a 20-something. And yet, he is someone who, by the time we hear him speak as president, is going to speak as no other American president has spoken about God, about purpose, about destiny, about what the future of America is in the larger cosmic sense. And when he comes to deliver his second inaugural address, he invokes the Bible, he invokes providential notions of God's control of events that are just an utter break from anything which has gone before in terms of presidential rhetoric, and which in truth we have never seen since. So the ironies multiply, and I thought that Redeemer President would capture the subtlety of those ironies, probably better than any other title I could dream of.
I'm sure we're going to get back to the second inaugural a lot. I imagine we all agree that it's his greatest speech by far. But I want to ask a much simpler question. When you started digging into Lincoln, what surprised you?
Almost everything. I had been, and no, I don't know if I would call it a student, maybe not even a fan, but I had been interested in Lincoln really from very early on. I think I was first bitten by a Lincoln bug when I was in second grade. I was journeying with my grandmother to Chicago, and we were in the great train station in Philadelphia, which is since gone. And there I pestered, begged, whined, and wheedled until she bought me a comic book biography of Lincoln. That was my introduction to Abraham Lincoln. It was a very good comic book, I have to say that. And from that, I always had a certain degree of interest in Lincoln. When I was in high school as a senior in government class, I wrote my senior government thesis on Lincoln's nomination to the presidency in 1860. And as a senior in high school, the director of our orchestra decided to program Aaron Copland's Lincoln portrait and had me serve as the narrator. So here I am, this 18-year-old, and I'm taking on writing about Lincoln's nomination and narrating Lincoln portrait. So, all right, I had some nodding acquaintance with Lincoln that way. Although I never really thought of myself as being a student of Lincoln. When I finally turned my attention to studying history and as a graduate student, what I was really interested in was American intellectual history, the history of American ideas. So that my PhD was written about 18th century moral philosophy. Not exactly the kind of subject people line up to hear about, but all right. 18th century moral philosophy. And that's really where I thought I was going to camp out, in writing about American philosophy. But at one point, I was working on a book that was going to be a book about the idea of determinism in modern American thought. Modern, in other words, from about 1800 to the present. And I remembered that Lincoln had had some things to say on this subject of determinism. They've talked about fatalism. And I thought, wouldn't it just be absolutely fiendishly clever of me to bring into this book about 19th century and 20th century American philosophy, Abraham Lincoln as a walk-on character. So I went to work on this one particular idea about Lincoln and determinism, and that was my first surprise, that there was much more there than I had realized. And as I began unearthing all the lines of thought that way, I was struck very forcibly by the fact that here was a man who had what we would regard as only the most primitive shreds of formal education. I mean, add it all up and it comes to less than a year. But who nevertheless had this extraordinary intellectual curiosity, who read such an extraordinary variety of things, and by virtue of possessing a well-nigh photographic memory, retained it all and could talk about it. Now, we don't often think about Lincoln as being a man of ideas. We think of him as being a politician. And sometimes we think of him as being a lawyer, but especially we think of him as being a politician, and we don't usually think of our politicians as being people of ideas. Maybe that says something about our politicians. So it is a surprise when you find Lincoln talking in a very sophisticated way about a doctrine of necessity. What does that mean? Where does he get this from? What are the sources? What has he been reading? And then you start to push still further on this. And you find moments, such as in John Hay's diary, when Hay is a secretary to Lincoln in the White House. And Hay writes in his diary, had a little talk with the T. He used the letter T for Lincoln. That was an abbreviation of the tycoon. That was what they called Lincoln behind his back. They had names for Mary Lincoln, too, that were much less complimentary. The Hellcat was one of them. Ooh, ouch. But the T had a talk with the T this evening on philology, for which he has a little studied interest. In other words, he didn't have much time to devote to it. You think, philology? If I were to take 99 out of 100 people off the sidewalk and ask them what philology was, I probably wouldn't get a very clear answer. It's structure of languages. He's interested in this. When the Republican National Committee was working on developing campaign biographies of Lincoln in 1860, they hired James Quay Howard to come out to Illinois and interview people and get testimony. They talked to John Todd Stewart, who had been his first partner in law, and Stewart said, Lincoln has a very deep interest in geology. What? So what it turned out was that the more I pushed into the subject of Lincoln, the more I began to find that here was someone who had his finger on the currents of almost every important intellectual discourse of the American 19th century, and yet who never flaunts it. And yet this is the mental environment in which this man flourishes. This is what describes the mental geography of Abraham Lincoln, which I thought was simply astonishing. I would never have dreamt of this. And yet there it was, and there was all the evidence that I was uncovering. So I never did finish that book on determinism in American philosophy. And I've got file boxes full of cards on it, but I'm sorry, I will never get to them. And I don't think anyone here tonight is sorry about that. But I wrote a paper about Lincoln and his doctrine of necessity, was invited to give it at the meeting of the Abraham Lincoln Association in Springfield, read it, and the response was really quite unusual. And then an editor at Erdman's, and tonight we have a banner behind us from Erdman's, who publishes Abraham Lincoln, Redeemer President. An editor from Erdman's got in touch with me and said, well, would you be interested in writing a religious biography of Lincoln? Because there was a series that Erdman's published, the Library of Religious Biography. And I listened and I said, no. Because I was aware there were a number of books on Lincoln and religion, and they tended to be special pleadings of various sorts. There was a book by a Swedenborgian claiming that Lincoln was a Swedenborgian. There's a book by a Baptist claiming Lincoln was a Baptist. And there was a book by, well, you know how it goes. And I thought, I really don't want to join that. Then he called me back. He said, we'd really like you to do a book on Lincoln and religion. I said, no. Then a friend of mine had been importuned by this editor. He called me and said, we'd really like you to do this book on Lincoln and religion. And I said, not a chance. Finally, the editor called me back and said, well, look, if you don't do this, we're going to get Professor so-and-so to do it. And I knew it's not any of the gentlemen here. I knew Professor so-and-so, and I thought, no. So I said, all right, look, I'm going to make you a deal you can't refuse. Okay, there's great shades of The Godfather. Well, I'm a grandfather, right? So that's close. I said to him, look, let me write a book about Lincoln and ideas, an intellectual biography of Lincoln, of which religion will be a part. But let me widen the scope of it. The editor was agreeable, and that's what happened. So it was a matter of, in a sense, getting my hand in the Lincolnian cookie jar and not being able to get it out. And always finding something more about Lincoln to push on. And surprise upon surprise upon surprise, the more I pushed. And you know, after all these years, the surprises haven't stopped. I keep being surprised by Lincoln. I keep being surprised by the man and by his environment. I keep finding new material to think about, to write about, and to talk about. And the well of Lincolniana just sometimes seems to be downright inexhaustible. The man is a source of extraordinary fascination, and I've devoted so much time to him and have not regretted a single minute of it.
Sounds a little bit like Herndon doing his interviews and realizing, gee, I worked with this guy for 16 years and I didn't know any of this stuff.
Oh, yes, I resonated with Herndon that way, especially when Doug Wilson and Rod Davis produced that remarkable volume in 1998, fall of 1998, Herndon's Informants, which was a marvelous comprehensive edition of Herndon's interviews. And yes, what really floated right to the surface was Herndon's surprise. I worked with these men all these years, and here's aspects of him I never knew. I liked to joke to Rod and to Doug that they were responsible for ruining my children's Christmas in 1998. Because that book came out just at the beginning of the Christmas season. And I got a copy of the book, and I spent that whole season reading that book. And my children have never forgiven me for it. But yes, Herndon and Herndon's discoveries. Because, you know, in a lot of ways, Lincoln tried very hard to keep things, some aspects of his life, very, very secret. He never liked to talk about his upbringing. I remember being struck by a letter that Charles Ray, who was an editor of the Chicago Tribune, wrote to Lincoln at the time of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And Ray wrote to him and said, I have the suspicion that Abraham Lincoln was not born with a silver spoon in his mouth. Now, we all will sit here and say, well, of course, yes, that's right, we all know that. Charles Ray wasn't sure. Lincoln, in 1858, is Lincoln the successful lawyer? He has been a member of Congress. He has come within an ace of the greatest upset in American political history, meaning the race against Stephen Douglas. And yet here was the editor, one of the co-editors actually, of the Chicago Tribune, scratching his head and not particularly sure. Now, what was your background like? When Lincoln had to fill out a form for Charles Lanham's biographical dictionary of Congress, Lanham supplied every living member of Congress with a blank that you had to fill out, you know, education, profession, things like that. Lincoln was very tight-lipped in filling it out. In the line for education, Lincoln used one word: defective. So he was, you know, he guards very carefully his past. One of his neighbors, a Baptist minister named Noyes Minor, tried to push a little bit, tried to find out some more, wanted Lincoln to talk about, well, what was it like when you were growing up? What was it like wherever it was you came from? And Lincoln responded to him and said, I have seen a great deal of the backsides of the world. We think today that pioneer image of Lincoln, born in the log cabin, raised on the front, we think that is somehow a romantic advantage. Lincoln didn't think so. He thought that the environment he grew up in was something to be ashamed of. When he would talk a little bit about his growing up, it usually wasn't in very complimentary terms, especially about his relationship with his father. He once described his father as being only barely literate, and the phrase he used was, his father knew how to bunglingly sign his own name, which doesn't really sound like a compliment. That's not the kind of thing you'd find on a Father's Day card. So he is at pains for people not to pry too closely into that past. He's not proud of it. One of the things Herndon discovered when he was doing all those interviews is that these people really were backwoods rubes. And one of them, one of his cousins, in fact, said that one of the prevailing songs of the day had been a parody of, Hail Columbia, Happy Land, a famous song of the time, but except it ran in the parody form. Hail Columbia, happy land, if you ain't drunk, I will be damned. And that more or less captured Lincoln's view of how he had grown up. He was not proud of that. He wanted to put as much distance as he could between him and his past. And that frequently made it very difficult to push on Lincoln. That also meant that a lot of people misjudged Lincoln. When you met Lincoln for the first time, you would meet what Caleb Carman, one of the people who was interviewed by Herndon, said. You would meet what you took to be a rough, intelligent farmer. And that meant that in a courtroom, another lawyer who didn't know Lincoln would immediately judge that what he was being asked to challenge was some country dolt. And one lawyer who practiced law with Lincoln out on the old Eighth Judicial Circuit for many years, Leonard Swett, said about Lincoln one of the things I think is probably the most accurate description about Lincoln ever written. He said, anybody who took Abe Lincoln for a simple-minded man would soon wake up with his back in a ditch. There were a lot of people in that ditch in the 1860s. So Lincoln is full of surprises, but that's because in his own day, he was full of surprises for people then, too.
So let's take something that's not surprising about Lincoln. Lincoln is known, of course, as the preserver, the savior of the Union, and, of course, the great emancipator. I think he can still be called that, but that's contested by many quarters. But he, of course, has set an unsurpassed standard for political oratory. I don't think anybody even comes close. Knowing that, and tackling the life of Lincoln in a biography, how did you approach the topic of Lincoln's oratory? How did you try to showcase the genius of the mind behind words that, if you really pay attention to them, aren't very highfalutin, very plain-spoken? How did you get at that mind, the ideas that fed into Lincoln as an orator?
Well, look at what is probably his most famous utterance, the Gettysburg Address. It's 272 words long. And it's uttered after all those people, some 15,000 people in the Soldiers' National Cemetery, had just listened for 2.5 hours to Edward Everett. 2.5 hours worth of extraordinary classical oratory, and no one afterwards could remember a single word of it. And Lincoln stands up and speaks for 2.5 minutes. And as Charles Sumner said, Lincoln could not have been more wrong when he said the world will little note nor long remember what we say here. Sumner said, oh, no. The world will always note and will always remember what he said here, what Lincoln said at Gettysburg was more important than the battle itself. 272 words. 190 of those words are single syllable. And it confirms a wisdom of Winston Churchill that short words are the best words to communicate, and the more short words, the better. And Lincoln has a grasp of that, because what Lincoln wants to do is to communicate with people. There are really two eras of Lincoln's oratory. There is an era from the first time he begins to speak in public in the 1830s until he comes back from his sole term in Congress in 1849. And the Lincoln of that oratory is a very standard, unsurprising Lincoln in terms of comparing him to other politicians. It's the oratory of attack and slash. It's the oratory of score points. It's the oratory of sensational zingers. And it's not really all that remarkable. There's very little that you pull out from Lincoln in those years and you say, well, isn't that fantastic? And then comes 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. He's galvanized back into political life, and then suddenly you're hearing an entirely different Lincoln. And I think 2 things have happened that have produced a great change in Lincoln's oratory. One is he has become more and more comfortable, sophisticated, and successful as a lawyer. And remember, this man is a trial lawyer. He's not a wills and estates person. He's not a corporation person. Doesn't sit in a desk and get papers from the inbox to the outbox. He's a trial lawyer. And he earns his keep by standing in front of juries and persuading them. And he has to do this in the hardest environment you can imagine. Because out on the 8th Judicial Circuit, he's going from one little lonely country courthouse to another, on that, sometimes as many as 14 of them on a single circuit. And he's speaking, and I've been in a number of the, and you've been in these courthouses too. You remember the courthouse in Mount Pulaski?
Not right off the...
All right, well anyway, that's probably the...
Then you've been there.
Right. The courthouse in Mount Pulaski is a real classic because it is almost completely unchanged from Lincoln's day. You can walk in there and see it as Lincoln would have seen it. And the great thing about these little courthouses were that you really only had one courtroom, and all the cases that were going to be heard on county court day all had to line up there in that courtroom. And a jury would have to be impaneled, and the lawyers would have to handle case after case, situation after situation. It was a real grueling event. But it also meant you had to be super quick on your feet. You had to be a quick study to master the intricacies of case after case after case. Then you had to turn around and talk to a jury of ordinary people. In many cases, a jury that had just been impaneled from farmers and clerks and whatnot standing in the back of the courtroom. And you had to persuade them. And if you didn't connect with them in the first 5 or 10 minutes, you weren't going to persuade anyone that way. He learned how to persuade people. And by the time we move into the 1850s, he's become a master of persuading people, of being able to take a problem, a situation, an idea, boil it down into a couple of lapidary sentences that just make it totally clear to everyone what the situation is. He becomes extremely good at that. And he's forced to do that because if he doesn't, he's not going to have much of a future as a lawyer. So he's very good at that. Now, that gets harnessed to a new kind of earnestness after 1854. An earnestness born out of the urgency he feels that the slave power is about to extend its tentacles. First, to control the territories, and then, as he makes clear in the House Divided speech, to extend those tentacles into the free states. And always at the back of the mind, there is this haunting demand of one haughty Southern politician that he looked forward one day to a slave auction being held at the foot of the Bunker Hill Monument. Now, we would look back and say, oh, well, that's so remote. That's such a baseless fear. Not in 1858, not in 1859. And that puts the fire into Lincoln. So when you wed that and put that with this man's persuasive powers, that's where you begin to see the genius of the oratory blossom. And you see it in his first inaugural address. You see it in the plaintiveness of his plea in conclusion. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. The mystic chords of memory. There's perhaps a third, and that illustrates perhaps a third source feeding this. That is love of theater. He had a great admiration for Shakespeare, could quote chunks of Shakespeare off by memory. All you had to do was to just get him going. And there is a certain element of the theatrical in Lincoln, as frankly, I suspect there's a certain element of theatrical in every good trial lawyer. And in that theatrical aspect of him, that being able to build a sense of drama, once again, that makes him an extraordinarily persuasive speaker. So that concision of expression, matched with the fervency and the passion of the motivation given to him by his situation, with that sense, that timing of the theatrical, that makes him a power to be reckoned with as an orator. You see it dramatically for the first time in the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Stephen A. Douglas believes he can go into these debates and he can just bowl Lincoln and the audience is over. He can shake that dark head of hair like a lion's mane. He can shake his fist and pound his feet, and that will persuade everyone. And instead, Lincoln gets up, and Lincoln starts to work on people's logic. One observer of the Lincoln-Douglas debate said that if you listened to Douglas for 5 minutes, you were totally won over by him. You couldn't help but be. But if you listened to Lincoln for 15 minutes, he would get the logical hook in your mouth, and he would just reel you in. That was Lincoln. Now, the funny thing is, when you reflect on the way people described Lincoln as a speaker, Douglas was an orator. Big, deep, opera voice. He could have been Pagliacci. Lincoln speaks with a high tenor voice, very, very sharp, also very penetrating, so that a crowd of 10,000 people could hear him without difficulty. And he spoke with this thick border accent. Frederick Law Olmsted was taken aback when he visited Lincoln in the White House, that Lincoln would reply about something and say, "I heard of that." And Olmsted, elite of the elite. And this is the man who designed Central Park. Olmsted wanted to scratch his head, like, where did they get this guy? After Lincoln's election, one editor wrote, this is one of my favorite lines because this is so classically wrong. One editor wrote in frustration after Lincoln's election, "Who will write this ignorant man's state papers for him?" Ooh. No, Lincoln was quite capable of communicating. He might have that high, piercing voice. He might have that thick accent. But what he said persuaded. And persuasion is the key to everything that he does as an orator, and how good he is at. I think the classic example is in a letter, a public letter that he writes. This is the Corning letter. And in it, he is talking about civil liberties questions. He's talking about the arrest of Clement Vallandigham for opposing the Northern Draft, the military conscription. And he asks this question: must I shoot a simple soldier boy who deserts, but not touch a hair of the wily agitator who induces him to desert? And as soon as he put it in those terms, it was, oh yeah, common sense. Lincoln's capacities to persuade, I think, are the key to his oratory. So he would not have been the kind of speaker you would go to listen to oral music, so to speak. But he would be the kind of person who would persuade you of a case because he could see right to the heart of it. He would see exactly what the issues were, and he would go to work convincing you of his way of seeing it. And that was real oratory.
Well, persuasion makes me think of another persuasive president who you really hammer pretty hard in your book, and that's Thomas Jefferson. And you all but say that Lincoln's use of the Declaration from 1854 up through the Gettysburg Address is calculated. You don't quite say it's cynical, but you say it's calculated. But don't you think there could be more of an affinity because great writers like great writing?
Lincoln.
And certainly Jefferson is, Jefferson's prose in its own way is as persuasive as Lincoln's.
He is. Jefferson is a great writer. And not just in the Declaration. If you look at the documents, even the documents that went before, the 1775 reasons for the separation of British America. And you read in Jefferson such logic and especially such passion. And even in Jefferson's letters, the clarity of the thought and the ideas that is there. And then his inaugural address, when he makes this offer, we are all Republicans, we are all Federalists.
Fire bell in the night.
Yeah, fire bell in the night. We have the wolf by the ears and we cannot let him go. He had a wonderful gift for imagery that way. I don't know that people were entirely bowled over by him as a speaker. People who knew Jefferson, who interacted with Jefferson, said that he tended to be something on the shy side as a talker, not terribly interesting to listen to as a talker, but as a great writer, as a wordsmith, as a huntsman of words. I mean, Jefferson certainly stands out in American politics. And I think in large measure, it was that Lincoln did admire. He found in the Declaration this eloquent statement in the very opening of the Declaration of principles that resonated with Lincoln's own experience, and found in the words of Jefferson what he called the axioms of liberty. In other words, not things you could demonstrate, things that just were true in and of themselves, and from which, like a geometrical theorem, you would then deduce certain conclusions. And yet there was also an aspect of Jefferson that he loathed, because he found in Jefferson a great detachment between the Jefferson of the ideas and the writing and the Jefferson of his personal practice. That he found especially in the stories about Sally Hemings, about slave ownership. He found these kinds of things in Jefferson to be absolutely reprehensible. What Lincoln could not abide were people who talked the talk but did not walk the walk. And to him, Jefferson was probably the most agonizing example of that. That here someone could pitch the principles of the American Republic at such a high level, and yet the practice of his life be at such a low level. That appalled him. And although he never will come out publicly and say, I'm going to stand in criticism of Thomas Jefferson. In fact, when he does talk publicly on one occasion about Jefferson, this is the letter he writes to Edward Pierce in 1859. This is where he'll talk about Jefferson as the one who is the author of these great ideas. But it's privately, when he's talking to Herndon, when he's talking to others, when in fact he writes probably an editorial, an unsigned editorial for the Macomb Eagle in the 1840s. He's sharply critical of Jefferson the hypocrite. Now, why would Lincoln be that hard on Jefferson? Probably, I think, it's because Lincoln really embraced the high ideals. And what he found reprehensible in Jefferson was that the low level of conduct would bring those high ideals into disgrace, would discredit them in the eyes of others. That people could always say, oh yeah, Jefferson had great things to say in the Declaration of Independence, but look at how he lived. And that means we should discount what he said in the Declaration. Lincoln always strove to be the man who talked and lived at the same moment and on the same level. And in very large measure he was. That was what he found fault with in Thomas Jefferson. That the ideas, the words were great, compelling, convincing. But the life then raised the question as to whether those words really had any substance. And that becomes a theme that Lincoln develops, not just about Jefferson, but about the very presence of slavery in the American Republic. In the great Peoria speech of October 1854, which I think is one of the greatest speeches Lincoln ever delivers. I think if we lost everything else that Lincoln had written or said, by some strange alchemy, all of that disappeared and left only the Peoria speech, you would still have all of Lincoln's principles right there. in that speech, he talks about slavery and what it means, why he finds it so reprehensible. And one of the things he focuses on is that the presence of slavery in the Republic gives the critics, the enemies of liberty, of free society, of self-government, it gives them a ground on which to say they don't really mean it. It doesn't really work. And in fact, this was true, because what Lincoln was referring to was an article he'd read in an English newspaper, raising exactly this issue. How can we take seriously what these Americans are talking about when they talk about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, when they're not really practicing it for 4 million of their fellow human beings? And this was, in fact, a frequent theme in commentary abroad on the American Republic. Samuel Johnson, at the time of the American Revolution, he says, why is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty from the drivers of slaves? And in 1820, Sidney Smith, in a famous article in the Edinburgh Review, says, the Americans have great ideas, the problem is the ideas have no substance. And the proof that they have no substance is that all the people who are talking about liberty also turn out to be the owners of slaves. How can we take them seriously? And Lincoln is stung by this. So when he encounters Jefferson, it's not that he has any lack of confidence in the ideas that Jefferson articulates. It's that Jefferson doesn't live up to them. And in a way, for Lincoln, that is almost the problem of the American Republic itself. That we have articulated these great ideas. Are we able to live up to them? And that really becomes the theme of his presidency. And in many respects, I think that's the theme of the legacy that Lincoln hands down to us. Are these principles that we talk about, is this creed, what he called a proposition to which we are dedicated, are we really capable of living up to it? He thought the Civil War was the acid test for that. In May of 1861, he said to John Hay, this war is going to prove, one way or the other, I'm paraphrasing Lincoln here, this war is going to prove one way or the other whether people are capable of self-government, or whether the first time we come face to face with a large-scale problem, we're all going to go to pieces. And if we all go to pieces, then what we have shown to all the aristocrats, all the dukes and the counts and the dictators and the czars, what we have shown to them is that they are right. And there's an odd echo of that even in someone like Otto von Bismarck. And Bismarck says to Karl Schurz, when Schurz is visiting Germany in the 1870s, after having been in exile from Germany for many years, Bismarck says to Schurz, you know, when I was a young man like you, I was a Republican. I wanted a republic, but I came to understand that the only way for a nation to become great, for a people to become great, was the monarchical principle. It has to be the aristocracy telling people what to do and fashioning their future by Eisen und Blut, by blood and iron. Lincoln says what the Civil War is going to show to us is whether people like that are right. And so at Gettysburg, he talks about the great Civil War that is testing whether this nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. I think he hands that challenge to every generation of Americans, not just those living at Gettysburg. I think he hands it to every generation, and I think it's handed to our generation as well, to show whether those Jeffersonian and Lincolnian principles can still be lived, whether ordinary human beings are capable of governing themselves. I think that's the real issue.
We're in the middle of what some people have called a history wars right now. How is it that we should think about, in particular in America, how we should think about our past and what for the longest time, although this is now contested, for the longest time we called the founding, right? The era of the spirit of '76, as Lincoln called it. Lincoln, in all of my reading, never speaks of the founders as hypocrites, never. He uses the word hypocrisy in some other contexts, but he never, on my reading, refers to the founders as hypocrites, even though in his many references to the founders, he also makes many references to slaveholding. So what's going on there? Why is it that Lincoln well knows what you recounted about one of the founders being true with other founders? How do we explain this? Why does Lincoln turn our gaze away from those imperfections? Why does he turn the public's gaze towards the things that he thinks are more worthy of our attention? What's going on there?
Well, here's the moment when Lincoln, raised in this very religious environment, but a religion that he puts a good deal of distance between himself and it's where that comes right back into his hands as an argument. He talks about the founders. He says of them laying out these marvelous ideas in the Declaration. And he says we have to understand that these are aspirations. This is the word he uses. These are aspirations, and he compares it to this passage in the Gospels. And he says, what we read in the Gospels is, be ye perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. Now, Lincoln says, we know that we are not perfect. But what we are being encouraged to do is to work towards that as a goal. We are going to try to be as perfect as we can be in our behavior. So that what the Savior lays out, Lincoln says, what the Savior lays out is an aspiration to which we strive. And his understanding of the founders is governed by that same aspirational principle, that the founders lay out an aspiration which we are going to continually work towards, which we're going to continually struggle to realize. And we're struggling to do that in the 1850s and the 1860s. We're struggling to push forward that way. But we're doing it not because the founding principles were wrong, or because even the behavior of the founders is somehow a refutation of those principles. It's because we understood from the very beginning that to lay out these principles about life, about liberty, about the pursuit of happiness, was to lay out an object, a goal to which we were going to work. So yes, we do start out at some position of imperfection, but we're conscious of it as imperfection. We don't try to defend the imperfection. We don't try to protect it. We recognize it and admit it as an imperfection and promise to ourselves we are going to work to rise above it. He compared it in another environment, in a more lethal way, to cancer. He talked about slavery as being like someone he had seen on a train, a man with a tumor on his face, who had his collar turned up because he really didn't want everybody to see this disfiguring tumor. Lincoln said it's that way with slavery. The founders understood that slavery was a tumor, and it embarrassed them. But they also knew that if you took a knife and tried to slice the tumor away, the patient would probably bleed to death on the spot. So what do? You try to work on the situation as medicine will allow you to work on it. You try to aspire to health. And you recognize that you can't take an immediate transformation and make that happen without sacrificing the life of the patient. He gives you a clear sense of how he wants to explain this in the great Cooper Institute speech. And Rick, you've written, I think, some of the very best material that's been written about the Cooper Institute speech. And in it he says, let's take a look at the founders' generation. He doesn't actually use the word founders, but this is what he means. He looks at the people who were part of the Constitutional Convention, and especially he looks at the people who were part of the first Congress who passed the Northwest Ordinance, which banned slavery in the Northwest Territories. He says, look, let's look at the people who were part of that Congress. See how many of them actually lined up to endorse the idea of banning slavery in the Northwest Territory, even though they themselves might have owned slaves. They're in a position, but they realize they want to get to this other position. They are working toward that. Lincoln's counsel is respect that. Let them work toward it. Because if we will work toward that, then we will get there. What he found happening in his day was that people had stopped being embarrassed about slavery, that people had started defending it as a positive good, that people like John Pettit of Indiana had declared that the Declaration of Independence and the idea that all men are created equal was a positive lie. He said, we have, just in the space of a few years, we have moved from a position that said, here is the Declaration of Independence, and we are moving towards the goals that the Declaration lays out. We have now moved in just a few years to a position where we're now saying that was all wrong. And Lincoln looks at this and says, if we are going to say that what was in the Declaration was wrong, then the whole American experiment has been for nothing. It has been a big mistake. Do we believe that? Do we really think that that was a mistake? Do we really believe that people are not capable of governing themselves, but instead are born to be ridden with saddles on their backs, as Jefferson said? No. No, we know that we have a different goal as Americans. And we must put by the voices that are telling us, no, the American experiment was all wrong. Whether those voices are the voices of slaveholders trying to defend slavery, or the voices of monarchs abroad. He says it really doesn't matter. He said this in the debates with Douglas, in the very last of the debates. He said it's the same spirit. It's the same spirit between kings and slaveholders. It's the same spirit that says, you toil and work and earn bread, and I'll eat it. And Lincoln says, whether that comes from the mouth of a king who seeks to bestride the people of his own nation and live by the fruit of their labor, or from one race of men as an apology for enslaving another race, it is the same tyrannical principle. We cannot recede from the Declaration. We must pursue it. It holds up the goal. And it is a goal which isn't just a fantasy land either. It is a goal which captures natural law. Because what are those goals in the Declaration about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, those inalienable rights? They are certain self-evident truths. There's so much truths that you don't have to explain them. That's why they're self-evident. As soon as people see them, as soon as people hear of them, they know that they're true. And they're true everywhere around the globe. In July of 1858, at the very beginning of the campaign between Lincoln and Douglas, he gives this marvelous speech in Chicago, July 10th, 1858. And he says, if the American Republic is simply built from the fact that we had this revolution against the mother country, and we just wanted to be different from the mother country, if that was all that was involved, then nobody today would understand what the United States is about, because most of the people in the United States today meaning 1858, were either born in some other country and came here as immigrants, or else they're the offspring of those who were immigrants. They haven't gotten a personal connection to the American Revolution. Or you try to invoke the shade of Nathaniel Greene or of George Washington, well, that's just a historical figure. But, Lincoln said, the American experiment is about more than that. The American experiment is about those truths in the Declaration that are true everywhere for everyone as matters of natural right and natural law, and which everyone sees and acknowledges, so that even if you talk to a new immigrant from, as he says, Germany, Scandinavia, France, even if you talk to a new immigrant or the children of immigrants, and you talk to them about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, about all men being created equal, they know at once that that is true. They resonate with that. They hear those words, and Lincoln said, they feel that they are flesh of the flesh and blood of the blood of those old men that wrote the Declaration, and so they are, because those words are the electric cord. The electric cord. This is before people have invented appliances to plug in. Those words are the electric cord that unite every lover of liberty. And for Lincoln, that's not just Jefferson's words. It's not just a proposition of a Virginian from the 18th century. Those are words that describe what is true, what is written in the heart and in the mind of every human being, and which we should aspire to. And anything less than that is to fall away not just from the example of the Revolution, it's to fall away from what is naturally true and morally right. So yes, we aspire to it. Do we fall short of it? Sure we do. But we aspire to it in the same way that we seek to be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect.
You started off by saying that what an irony it was that this man who rebelled against his youthful religion becomes, by the time he's president, the most religious president we had ever had and have ever had since. And you said the second inaugural in particular is an instance of this. And I think it's like late Beethoven. It's just almost in another world, even from his other speeches, great though they are. But I have a couple problems with it, and I want to raise one. This is Lincoln basically describing everything. He's describing American history. It's his 1619 project, 250 years of unrequited toil at 1615, but close enough. He's explaining why we had to have this war, why it came upon us. It's to pay off all that national sin. And then he's describing what we have to do to be better, to go forward and to not be like that anymore. But there are no black people in it. They appear as the bondmen, the two who toiled for 250 years, and implicitly their backs were the ones that were lashed. And Lincoln has spoken about black people before in his speeches. I mean, maybe not a lot, but regularly. He talks about the black woman who has the right to earn the bread that she makes with her hands as much as me or Judge Douglas or any man. And then he has this running joke about there are enough black men to marry all the black women, so let them be married. And that's to rebut the Democratic charge that Republicans are just race mixers. And then a couple weeks later, he's going to give the last speech of his life, and he's going to say, maybe black veterans and very intelligent black men should vote in Louisiana. So he is aware of black people. They're in his mind and they're in his speeches. But here in this speech where he's really grappling with everything, oh yes, there's also God in the speech. So it's not just humans and human history. The Almighty is one of the characters. But why are black people there only as occasions for white sin?
Because at the time of the second inaugural, the real fear he had was how whites were going to behave. He didn't lack a lot of confidence in what he thought the future for black people was going to be. And that's something that he makes clear not only in that last speech on April 11th, but it's also what he makes clear in a number of comments that he makes, for instance, to his staffer, William Stoddard, when he sends Stoddard out to supervise Reconstruction in Arkansas. He says, make sure that the vote gets into the hands of the freed people, because that's going to be the most important lever for them for the future. He will write instructions for his generals in command on the occupied Carolina coast, telling them, if freed slaves are in possession, it means occupation, of the land that they're farming, respect that. Let them farm it, let them get an income from it. All right, they may not have all the proper papers filed in the local courthouse, but that's neither here nor there. They have, in a sense, earned that right, he says, and the soldiers who are the occupying forces must protect that. So he's looking to a future in which he is seeing black people as Americans, as citizens on an equal basis with everyone else. In fact, he says when he's in Richmond, making that last visit of his life, he says, you shall have all the rights that everyone else has. And anyone who tries to tell you that you don't, show them the sword and the bayonet, which is pretty frank. I think that if Lincoln had lived, and that's probably the question that I think I'm asked the most in talking about Lincoln, what would have happened if Lincoln had lived? I think there's a few things that are fairly clear. Lincoln would have gone for the vote, definitely, because the vote would have been important not just for black people, it also would have been important for the future of the Republican Party. Because at the end of the war, the southern states, which have been largely Democratic, are going to come back into the Union. They're going to elect Democratic representatives. How are you going to keep them from seizing control of Congress? You can only do that by enfranchising black people. So there's a practical aspect to it. But I think also he was thinking in terms of economic leverage, and that is what's connected to land ownership. I think there's a curious way in which even the Homestead Act of 1862 plays a role this way. He sees this as a future. He's thinking a lot about the West as a possible home for freed slaves. But he's thinking in terms of a new way of talking about citizenship. In a letter that he writes to General James Wadsworth in January of 1864, and I know there's been question about the Wadsworth letter, but in it he's very clear. He says, if the Southerners expect to be welcomed back into the Union, there's going to have to be a price for it, and the price for it is definitely going to have to be the vote. You can't keep the vote out of the hands of the freed slaves. He had some directions he wanted to move that I think can be fairly discerned as the possibilities he would have explored had he lived. But that's not what really is worrying him in the second inaugural. What's worrying him in the second inaugural is how white people are responding. And in this case, curiously enough, his own party, his own friends, his own supporters. Lincoln loved democracy. He said over and over again that self-government, that's the system of justice. But he was also aware of the possibility of democracy's deficits, that democracy makes mistakes from time to time. I think that's what's at work in the famous temperance address in 1842, because he's worried that people can drink away through vice, through bad habits, the advantages that democracy confers upon people. How can you talk about self-government if you're not in control of yourself? He's also worried about democracy when he gives the Peoria speech, because he's worried about democracy's reputation being sullied by slavery. He's worried about democracy in the Gettysburg Address. And the great thing that Gettysburg does for Lincoln is to give him this sense that ordinary people, there's 3,500 Union dead buried in the cemetery, they have justified by their sacrifice so much of what democracy means. The European monarchies had looked upon the ordinary man as scum. And you find this in European commentary that, there's this poem by Heinrich Heine, Where Shall We Go Now? Where Heine says, I think I'll leave Germany. I think I'll go to that great big pig pen of freedom called America, where all these louts and boors live in freedom. That was not a compliment. And you read Dickens, in Martin Chuzzlewit, where Dickens is just unsparing on Americans. His image of Americans is just a bunch of creeps. And Lincoln looks over that crowd at the cemetery, over those semicircular rows of graves, and he says, here are ordinary people who gave everything they had to give in defense of democracy. There is something transcendent there. There is a rainbow there. But what worried him at the end of the war was that there was another way democracy could be destabilized. That was by vengeance. Because vengeance is as incompatible with democracy as loss of self-control, as enslavement. Vengeance has no role in a democracy. And that is why in the second inaugural, he's really speaking to his own people. He's saying to them, look, what has happened in this Civil War? It's not time for a victory lap. It's not time for us to beat our breast and say, see how righteous we were. God has justified us by giving us victory. It's now time to put our boot on the neck of those Southern slaveholders. And Lincoln's comment is, no, 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 no. No, both North and South, Americans as a whole, over 250 years, bear the burden and the responsibility for slavery. We have all had our hands in the toilet. And it's because of that that God's justice has been manifest in giving a war to North and South alike. And anyone who wants to object to that and say, no, 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 we were the right party, we were the good guys, Lincoln drops back and says, well, this is what God says, and shall not the judge of all the earth do right? It was a little tongue-in-cheek, but it was not more tongue-in-cheek than a similar comment he makes to Douglas when Douglas is trying to quote scripture to him, and Lincoln backs off and says, yes, but I have a contrary scripture from a higher authority, quoting the Gospels. And Lincoln does something of the same thing in the second inaugural. And having checked that thirst for vengeance, he says, what is the real way forward? When we acknowledge that we all bear a part in this sin, that will lead us to have charity for all and malice toward none. It will lead us to take up the burden of the widow and the orphan. It will lead us to seek peace, lasting peace with ourselves and with all nations. He does not see, perhaps he would have had he lived, but he does not see in March of 1865 that the real threat, the real vengeance was going to come not from overenthusiastic Northerners, but from truculent and undefeated Southerners who invent a lost cause mythology to justify what amounts to a practical re-enslavement of the slave. Lincoln doesn't see that.
Good evening, I'm Robert George, and I am the McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence and Director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University, the lead sponsor of tonight's program. And it's my happy duty to thank our distinguished panelists for an outstanding presentation and discussion. Every now and then I have a good idea, and one of the best that I ever had was to move Alan Guelzo from Gettysburg College to Princeton University, where he's our Thomas W. Smith Research Scholar. And how great it is to have such eminent scholars as Rick Brookhiser and Lucas Morel to enter into conversation with Alan. Please join me in thanking Lucas and Rick. Special thanks to the people who worked so hard to give us this evening. I want to especially acknowledge my program manager at the Madison program, Deborah Parker, who really did the lion's share of the work in putting this together. I want to thank Tricia and Alex and Erica and the Ford's theater staff and Ford's Theater for giving us such a wonderful venue for this event. And I want to thank our co-sponsors, the Ethics and Public Policy Center here in Washington, D.C., under the great leadership of Ryan Anderson, the American Enterprise Institute, whose great leader Robert Doar is with us tonight, together with Yuval Levin, the Lincoln Group of the District of Columbia, the School of Public Affairs of American University, and I'm delighted that Tom Merrill, who's the leader there, is joining us. And I want to thank all of you for coming out for such a special event. Alan and Rick and Lucas all managed to remind us that Lincoln challenges every generation of Americans, and he certainly challenges this generation. This is a generation, our generation. We live at a time of deep division, deep polarization, So Lincoln challenges us to deal with that in a Republican way, in a way fitting for a self-governing people. But he does more than challenge us, as Alan reminded us at the very end. He also shows us the way to meet the challenge. So let's go forward with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. Good evening, everyone.